Welcome, dear learners. Welcome to the lecture series on investment management. Dear learners, today we try to understand the concept of risk. Now, the term risk has a variety of meanings. In the general scenario, risk is defined as any uncertain event. That is, an event which is uncertain. Then such event is referred to as risk. Now, in terms of company or in the company setting, the risk refers to any event or possibility of an event which can impair corporate earnings or cash flows over short, medium and long-term horizon. That is, any event or any situation which can impair the corporate earnings. That means which can cause a difference or deviation in the corporate earnings, then such term or such event is called as risk. It is the potential for future returns to vary from the expected returns. That is, people always expect returns, but the actuals may be different. So the difference between the expected returns and the actual returns, it is also termed to be risk, or it is because of risk. Now, risk is one of the important factor to be considered while investing, because if you can minimize the risk, you can maximize the returns. That is the reason why it has got huge importance in the investment decision process. If you are not taking care of risk, then you could not reap good return. So it plays an important role in investment decision process. Now, once we have understood the concept of risk and how important it is in the investment decision process, let us identify the sources from where the risk arises. Now, this risk arises from variety of sources and it affects the value of the assets held by any corporation. So it becomes important to understand the sources of risk. The first source of risk is economic policies of governments. We all know that governments frame policies, rules, regulations, but these policies or rules or regulations may have positive or negative impact on the companies. If the policies made by the government bring in positive impacts, it is well and good. But if it has any negative impacts, then it is risk to the company. Next is changes in the money supply. Now, the apex bank in India to control the supply of money is RBI. So, because of the policies made by the RBI and the changes in the money supply will bring in the risk to the company. That is the reason why we have specified changes in the money supply as a source of risk. The third important source is levels of inflation and interest rates. The inflation and fluctuations in the interest rates also bring in or will become possible sources of risk. Inflation diminishes the purchasing power of the consumer. With the reduced purchasing power, a consumer cannot purchase any commodities, and these situation will affect the companies a lot. That is the reason levels of inflation and interest rates are possible sources of risk to the company. And that is the reason why always the government wants to keep checking inflation, or to put a check to inflation or maintain inflation in desired levels. The next important source of risk is consumption and savings propensities. Now, people have got different consumption patterns and they also have different saving patterns. It differs from person to person and country to country. Because of these patterns of savings and consumption, companies might assume risk. And the last important source of risk is technological factors. See, everywhere there are changes. In the same way, technology is also changing at a faster rate. If the company fails to incorporate those changes into their entity, then it could not compete with the competitors, which can be a probable source of risk for the company, which can impair the corporate earnings, or which can drag away the market share by the competitors. Now, these are some sources of risk what I have mentioned, but I am not limiting the sources to only these 5. I have mentioned only 5, but there are many, but I have mentioned an important source of risk out of many. So, next is, once we have understood the source of risk, let us understand the types of risk. Now, if you want to get a better understanding of the risk, we need to understand about types of risk. If we look into various types of risks faced by an organization, we can see credit risk, market risk, price risk, interest rate risk, and technology risk, systematic and unsystematic risk. Let us discuss each of these risks in detail. The first one is credit risk. Credit risk arises when one party fulfills the obligation and other party fails to fulfill the obligation in a contractual arrangement. For example, A lends sum of ₹100 to B, and B promises to return after 1 year. Now A, by lending ₹100, he has fulfilled his obligation. But at the end of 1 year, if B fails to fulfill his obligation by paying back of ₹100 to A, then the risk arised is called credit risk. Then comes the market risk. Market risk is because of various factors. Market risk is the risk of losses due to movements in the financial market variables. These variables may be interest rates, foreign exchange rates, security prices, etc., etc. Now, because of these factors or fluctuation in these factors, whatever the risk arises is called market risk. The next type of risk is called price risk. Price risk is also an important risk. Price is a market driven measure of value. Now, A seller's intention is to get the maximum price for the commodity or security he wants to sell, and buyer's interest is to pay the least possible price for the sale. The possibility of not realizing the expected price is called the price risk. If I expect to sell my product at 100 rupees, if I could not realize 100 rupees by selling, if the product is not able to sell itself for 100 rupees, then the possible risk is called price risk. Now next we have interest rate risk. Now generally banks, financial institutions, etc. face these type of risk, and also individuals. So interest rate risk is due to the fluctuations in the interest rates. Because of the this fluctuation in the interest rates is because again dependent on many economic factors. Now because of these fluctuations, the company assumes risk. So the next type of risk is called technology risk. As discussed, technology always changes. It keeps on changing. But if the company fails to incorporate the advanced technology into the entity, it may assume technological risk. The most important and the last type of risk is called systematic and unsystematic risk. Systematic risk, we also call it as market risk, and unsystematic risk we call it as individual risk or company risk. Systematic risk is something caused by market factors, and it is similar to all the companies. That is, it is not different to different companies, but systematic risk affects at a time to all the companies and at the same rate. But unsystematic risk is something called as individual risk or company level risk. It is basically because of the company's policies, decisions, rules and regulations. It is called unsystematic risk. Now after understanding the types of risk, let us understand the measurement of risk. Until now we have discussed the concept of risk, sources of risk, types of risk. Now let us understand the measurement of risk, with which we will be completing the total concept of risk. Now if you want to manage the risk, the first thing you need to do is you need to measure it. If the doctor wants to control the fever, if the doctor wants to control the fever or the disease, he should measure it with a thermometer, so that he can analyze the fever and write a prescription of medicines which can cure the fever. In the same way, if you want to minimize the risk, it is important to measure the intensity of risk assumed by the company, so that you can put up some strategies to minimize the risk assumed by the company. Now there are some measurement tools available to measure the risk. The first one is called range, the second one is called standard deviation, and the third one is called coefficient of variation. See, we will take up the tool called range. Now range is the difference between two extreme values. Extreme values, when we say extreme values, that is the difference between the two extreme ends, that is highest and lowest value. That is called the range. So when we want to use these tools to measure risk will be taking up two extreme values, that is highest level and the lowest level. The difference between these two levels is called range. The next tool is called standard deviation. See, standard deviation is the amount of deviation of a term from the original standard, or an average. Here the standard is called average. So the amount of deviation of an item from the average is called standard deviation, which is an important, which gives an important, which serves as an important item for analysis of risk. Next we have coefficient of variation. So coefficient is called a numerical value which quantifies risk. So here coefficient of variation is a numerical value which quantifies the variation or the deviation in the expected and the realized returns, or the expected or actual returns. Now we will be discussing all these measurements in unit number 4. So that is the reason why we are not discussing the computation procedure here. So now let us sum up what we have studied in this unit. We have studied the concept of risk, the sources of risk, the types of risk, and the measurement of risk. With this, we have completed the concept of risk. I will be coming up with next lecture soon. Till then, good day, goodbye.